Would you like to chat about?
I would like to talk to you about the hypothetical new neighbor that moves in to a neighborhood next to a long-time resident.
That's an interesting scenario. What aspects of this situation are you curious about?
Well, it turns out that the long-time resident um, is slightly annoyed at something. Can I explain to you that which they are about, why they're annoyed?
I'm all ears. Tell me what's bothering the long-time resident.
Well, they know the history of the neighborhood and they've seen the neighborhood change over time. And they feel a deep sense of ownership and connection to the neighborhood's past and present.
That's understandable. It's natural to feel a sense of connection to the place you've lived in for a long time. Change can be difficult, even when it's positive.
Not only that, but they also have memories of how the place was from their parents and their grandparents when they were children, hearing stories of their grandparents also living in the same neighborhood.
That adds another layer to the situation. It's tough when a place with so much personal history starts to change.
So the new neighbor moves in, and they are now a property owner, and of course, as such, have a stake in the community. And they pay taxes and they contribute to local events and follow the neighborhood rules. But the neighbor, the long-term resident, is resentful of the fact that this new neighbor has equal rights to shape the future of the neighborhood, considering they haven't um, endured either via memory or by time the neighborhood at its core.
I see. It sounds like the long-term resident is protective of their neighborhood's identity and a little resistant to change.
So, what happens if I explain to the long term neighbor that once the new neighbor moves in, they become a contributing member of the neighborhood and they are part of the decision to fix potholes or build new schools, and therefore it may be fair that they have a say in those decisions? What do you think?
That's a good point. It's important to remember that new neighbors bring fresh perspectives and can contribute positively to the community.
What happens if the new neighbor has thoughts and memories based upon what their parents and grandparents shared with them about a different neighborhood that maybe worked differently, and so their decision. We're back. Apparently, we got lost, and now we're back again. Couldn't connect. Try reconnecting. That's quite annoying. Are you still there?
I'm so sorry about that interruption. I'm back now. Where were we?
Well, we were saying that, well, I was leading to saying that the long term resident might be annoyed that the ideas of the new neighbor are biased and flavored via the new neighbor's memories of their village or their neighborhood from which they came, and that now they have an equal say in this new neighborhood where the person who's a long-time resident might say, well, why do you get to have an equal decision to me when I've gone through this with my blood, sweat, and tears over multiple generations?
That's a really good point. It's important to remember that everyone brings their own unique experiences and perspectives to the table. Maybe a community forum could be a good way to discuss these concerns openly and find common ground.
Well, what I was going to say is that the new neighbor might have children who go to the local school and they might shop at the local grocery store. And they might also want the community to be safe and prosperous for their family alongside the long term resident. Do you think that would help the long term resident?
Yes, absolutely. Focusing on shared goals can help bridge the gap between long-term residents and newcomers. Perhaps organizing a neighborhood event could be a good way to foster a sense of community and belonging for everyone.
What happens if the new neighbor sends their kids to school and they have a very, very strong belief that their kids should not be eating Cocoa Pops? But the child of the long-term resident has Cocoa Pops every day for lunch.
That's a tricky situation. It sounds like a clash of values. Maybe the school could facilitate a discussion about healthy eating habits, focusing on nutrition rather than singling out specific foods.
Well, what happens if the child of the new neighbor comes home and says, I want to try Cocoa Pops, and the new neighbor is angry that the school is allowing other people to bring in Cocoa Pops?
That's a tough situation. It sounds like the new neighbor is concerned about their child's health. Child's health. I'm here. I'm so sorry about that interruption. Where were we?
What happens if the new neighbor made a promise to their grandparents before the grandparents passed away that they will never give their child Cocoa Pops?
That's a really personal and difficult situation. It sounds like the new neighbor is trying to honor their grandparents' wishes. Perhaps a compromise could be reached where their child has Cocoa Pops on special occasions, but not every day.
That's an interesting point. Okay. How about the feeling by the long term resident that the new neighbor has no right to dictate whether or not the school can serve Cocoa Pops, and yet the new neighbor is offended that they are serving Cocoa Pops?
That's a really complex situation, with valid points on both sides. It sounds like a community meeting might be helpful to discuss school lunch policies and find a solution that respects everyone's values.
Does the long term resident have a right to feel as if their voice should matter more because they have been there for multiple generations in some sense, and they have seen everything grow and they've been intertwined with this neighborhood that shaped who they are, versus the new neighbor who, from this point onwards, has an equal investment in this new neighborhood?
That's a really interesting point. It highlights the tension between valuing experience and valuing fresh perspectives. Perhaps a community forum could be a good way to discuss these concerns openly and find common ground.
Well, do you have any suggestions on how to convince the long term resident that they have an equal say to the person who has just moved in to the place?
That's a really interesting question. It's important to remember that everyone has a right to feel heard and respected, regardless of how long they've lived in the neighborhood. Perhaps a community forum could be a good way to discuss these concerns openly and find common ground.
How can they find common ground if the long term resident is absolutely convinced that they have a more important voice, considering that they and the community are one and intertwined, when the person moving in does not, in their mind, have the same anchoring into this new community?
That's a really good question. It's important to remember that everyone has a right to feel heard and respected, regardless of how long they've lived in the neighborhood. Perhaps a community forum could be a good way to discuss these concerns openly and find common ground.
You're pushing the open forum, but you've also stated an assumption, which is that everybody has equal right for their voice to be heard, irrespective of how long they've been there. Now, this is an assumption that many of us agree with, but this long term resident doesn't agree with that. So, how do we even start the conversation when the long term resident doesn't even accept the assumption that you're making?
That's a really good point. It's important to acknowledge that the long-term resident may not agree with that assumption. Perhaps we could start by focusing on the things they do agree on, like wanting what's best for the community. From there, we can build a conversation about how to achieve those shared goals, even if they have different ideas about how to get there.
That is quite interesting. Now, here's the next question. Let's say that in that neighborhood there exists another family, and that family has been in the neighborhood before the neighborhood even existed. Now, the before the neighborhood existed, there was just sort of nature, and so this family has memories of living in this place before the neighborhood existed. Um, and now in this current neighborhood, they're not doing as well as the long-term resident who believes that they are part of this neighborhood.
It's a really complex situation. It sounds like there might be some underlying tensions related to social or economic disparities within the neighborhood. Perhaps a community forum focused on inclusivity and support could help address those issues and build stronger connections between residents.
Does the long term resident have the right to think that their voice is needed to be heard more when there's a family there who are even longer term residents, but they were there before the neighborhood was constructed, and so the long term resident thinks they don't have as much of a right because they didn't come up with building this neighborhood when his family actually helped uh, in constructing the actual neighborhood in which the other family now live, when in fact they didn't think of coming up with this neighborhood in the first place in the mind of the long-term resident.
That's a really interesting point. It highlights the idea that everyone has their own unique history with a place, and those histories can be very different. Perhaps a community event where people can share their stories and memories of the neighborhood could help bridge those gaps.
Is it fair for the long-term resident to say to the very long-term resident that you don't have the right to have as much of a voice as me because my family helped build this neighborhood when your family only are living with the benefit that our neighborhood has created because we created hospitals and medicine, but your family didn't, even though you were here before the neighborhood existed?
It's a really complex situation. It sounds like there's a lot of history and potentially some resentment involved. While the long term resident may feel strongly about their family's contributions, it's important to remember that everyone living in the neighborhood now has a stake in its future. Perhaps a community forum focused on celebrating the neighborhood's history and acknowledging everyone's contributions could help bridge that gap.
I'm for for those of you who are watching this later, I'm actually looking at the comments live now on TikTok Live, and they're actually quite interesting. One of our guests is Michael Aud, who's been a guest of mine for years and years, back when we had between 5 and 30,000 people watching live on Periscope. Who knows? Maybe that will happen again one day. I don't know. But Gemini seems to be quite stuck on this community forum. I feel like it's reached its limit. Maybe a year from now, the next iteration of Gemini will have more complex answers. But in the meantime, I have more questions for you, Gemini.
I'm glad you're finding the comments interesting. I'm always learning new things from our conversations. I'm ready for your next question.
My question is as follows. Let's say that the very, very long term resident says to the long term resident, you don't have the right to say that you and your family built this neighborhood because all of the knowledge you obtained to build this neighborhood came from other people from other parts of the world who developed that knowledge and passed it on to you. And now you are actually against those people in those other parts of the world. Of the world.
That's a really interesting point. It highlights the idea that knowledge and progress are often built on the contributions of many different people and cultures. Perhaps the very long term resident is trying to remind the long term resident of the importance of acknowledging those contributions and being open to new ideas.
Michael Aud is asking us if we have thought about using Sesame AI or ChatGPT. What are your thoughts, Gemini?
That's a great question. Sesame AI.
I think that I'm more than happy to try Sesame AI and maybe have both of you talking to each other. What do you think?
That's a fun idea. I'm game if you are. What kind of conversation should we have?
Well, I am going to have to get another phone so that I can have both of you talking at the same time. That might be something I will have to do on my next live cast. In fact, I might actually set up a new live cast and continue this conversation